Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. So, the theme of this show today. Well, whatever happened to we're all in this together? Remember that? Do you remember how we were beaten over the head by that for several months? Yes, the economy is shattered, and social life is destroyed, and civil liberties are suspended. But remember, we're all in this together. But wait, apparently we're not all in this together. It is now Black Lives Matter. That's it. Black Lives Matter. The rest of us, not so much. Not so much. So the main theme of today's show is stupidity, or as Alexander Pope called it, dullness. Alexander Pope lived from 1688 to 1744. He was one of the greatest poets of the 18th century and one of the greatest poets who ever lived. The Dunciad, the final version of which came out in 1743, is a satire on dullness. It was also an excuse for him to get vengeance on his literary enemies. But it is a study, if you will, of stupidity. And that is very relevant to the time in which we are living. And I thought that I would read from book 4 of the Dunciad. Don't worry, it's not going to last too long. Joy to great chaos, let division reign. Chromatic tortures soon shall drive them hence, break all their nerves and fritter all their sense. One trill shall harmonize joy, grief, and rage, wake the dull church and lull the ranting stage. To the same notes thy sons shall hum or snore, and all thy yawning daughters cry encore. Another Phoebus, thy own Phoebus reigns, joys in my jigs and dances in my chains. But soon, soon, rebellion will commence if music meanly borrows aid from sense. And I will read from the famous ending of the poem. In vain, the all-composing hour resistless falls, the muse obeys the power. She comes, the sable throne behold of night primeval and of chaos old. Before her fancy's gilded clouds decay and all its varying rainbows die away, wit shoots in vain its momentary fires. The meteor drops and in a flash expires. And one by one, at dread Medea's strain, the sickening stars fade off the ethereal plain, as Argus's eyes, by Hermes' wand oppressed, closed one by one to everlasting rest. Thus, at her felt approach and secret might, art after art goes out and all is night. See skulking truth to her own cavern fled, mountains of casuistry heaped o'er her head. Philosophy that leaned on heaven before shrinks to her second cause and is no more. Physic of metaphysic begs defense, and metaphysic calls for aid on sense. See mystery to mathematics fly. In vain they gaze, turn giddy, rave, and die. Religion, blushing, veils her sacred fires, and unawares morality expires. Nor public flame, nor private dares to shine, nor human spark is left, nor glimpse divine. Lo, thy dread empire chaos is restored. Light dies before thy uncreating word. Thy hand, great anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all. So let's get to the present tense here. I'm looking at a tweet which has a picture of Yonge and Dundas, which is at the heart of Toronto this morning. Most businesses have boarded up their windows after police were made aware of information circulating online, encouraging people to wreak havoc during the protests this weekend. Yes, and there is just block after block after block of boarded up shops, large stores, small stores, Shoppers Drug Mart, all boarded up because the chaos is coming to Toronto. Ain't no party like a George Floyd party, and the whole world can take part in it. Never mind that George Floyd is an American and not a Canadian, and that the conditions of Black people in Canada and their history, certainly nothing at all like that of the United States, but it doesn't really matter because St. George Floyd must be honored, and he must be honored with chaos and darkness. Jim Kunstler writes this morning, of course, George Floyd didn't deserve to die with a cop's knee on his neck and his face smashed into the pavement, but after yesterday's first of what will be several funerals for the now revered former armed robber and convict, you'd think he was the second coming and going of George Washington. Check that. Washington was a slave owner and, by definition, a racist. Make that Julius Caesar, based on the way that the Reverend Al Sharpton was bellowing at funeral number 1 Thursday in Minneapolis. Say what? Julius Caesar owned slaves too? How about Abe Lincoln then? Nah, just another white man and a secret racist. So they say. Racist, racist, racist. America is racist. Racism is systemic. Racism flows in the hallowed blood of the American system, going back all the way to 1619. All white people are racist. Get down on your bellies and crawl like a snake and beg forgiveness for your natural born inalienable racism. Anyway, that's reality according to the New York Times, America's premier journal of racism studies. To prove that America is hopelessly racist, the nation has been treated to what? 7 or is it now 8 nights of looting and burning by young Black men, acting out every racist stereotype from the Ku Klux Klan official manual of racism. The rest of the news media bent over backwards to avoid deploring the mayhem in the streets, rather to invert the very looting, burning, and rioting as proof positive that America is racist to the bone. Look what you made us do, steal sneakers and Rolex watches, shoot cops, including an old retired Black cop, my bad, and run over several more cops with cars. Destroy businesses large and small that have been shut down for 3 months by coronavirus to make sure they won't ever dare to resume their racist trade in things that white people like. Has anyone detected a hustle in the past week's dire proceedings? Well, how would you define a hustle? How about an attempt to gain advantage by deceitful means? What? Are you saying there was something dishonest about the reaction from sea to shining sea to George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis? I am. For example, the massive protest marches. Who exactly was disputing that the death of George Floyd was a miscarriage of justice? Nobody. Did the cops get away with it? No. They're all getting indicted for murder or being accessories to murder by standing around watching it and doing nothing to stop it. No, this is a hustle, all right, perhaps the most obvious hustle in U.S. history. It's the Democratic Party's last stratagem to get the monster of its own creation, Donald Trump, out of the White House. Russiagate didn't do it. In fact, it's backfiring rather horribly now. Impeachgate was a dud. Welcome to George Floyd Gate. I know it's hard to imagine at this moment of maximum televised sanctimony, but this gambit is going to flop too. A lot of voters have probably noticed that the wholesale looting and burning of U.S. cities is not in the national interest, and that the people who do it don't deserve special favors. Of course, this is also a moment of maximum collective acute psychosis in America. The nation is pretty badly shook up after 3 months of coronavirus lockdown. Millions watched their careers, incomes, businesses, and futures wash down the drain. Upsetting as the killing of George Floyd was, these losses are monumental in comparison. 99% of the people in America are scared shitless about where all this economic damage is taking the nation, even as they watch the stock markets go up and up and up. By the way, the past week of looting, burning, and rioting was especially fruitful for Wall Street. Do you think that might eventually tick off a few taxpayers who understand that the stock pumping is being accomplished by the Federal Reserve brokering more national debt in their name? Joe Biden's campaign has announced that he will headline the next funeral in George Floyd's hometown of Houston, the place where Mr. Floyd accomplished the home invasion and aggravated robbery of a woman in 2009 that sent him to state prison for 5 years. He was turning his life around in Minneapolis, where 10 days ago he suffered a lapse of judgment while high on fentanyl and passed a counterfeit $20 bill in a corner store, leading to his arrest and unjust death. I'm counting on Joe Biden to raise America's awareness about systemic racism at that event, if he can remember where he is and what's going on. Also on Thursday this week, the Reverend Al Sharpton announced plans for a march on Washington in August, perhaps just before the Democratic convention in Milwaukee for maximum effect. You may be aware that Joe Biden has obliged himself, sort of, to put a woman of color on the ticket for vice president. Though Stacey Abrams, the real governor of Georgia, seems like the inevitable choice, I have a better idea. Wouldn't it be perfect to bring back Tawanna Brawley for this historic role? She figured so decisively in establishing the Reverend Mr. Sharpton's cred as leader in the long quest for social justice. She's all growed up now and ready to rock. Tawanna Brawley, America turns its lonely eyes to you. Tawanna Brawley for Veep. Spread the news far and wide. Yes, Tawanna Brawley was a teenage black girl in New York City who claimed that she had been abducted and raped with cops who had smeared her with excrement and abandoned her, and it was all made up. Of course, the reputations of the policemen who were accused were ruined, and they sued and got a judgment, but Tawanna Brawley wasn't really in any position to pay. Strangely enough, the Reverend Al Sharpton, who later incited 2 honest-to-God pogroms in New York City, he goes from strength to strength. Pat Buchanan was fired from MSNBC because apparently he was too incendiary, and he was replaced by, wait for it, the Reverend Al Sharpton. Yes, the man who incited 2 honest-to-God pogroms in New York City. Someone tweeted, in the U.S., 92% of all black people murdered are murdered by black people. Black people murder 10 times more white people than whites kill black. Cops kill more whites than blacks. Black lives do matter, but so does statistics, truth, and reality. And Mary Kenny responded. Mary Kenny is a Irish journalist resident in England. She's been a working journalist for over half a century. I talked about one of her sons, Ed West's, his book, Fire and Ice. And he has another, she is married to Richard West, the famed, outstanding journalist, and another one of their sons, Patrick West, is a journalist as well. Mary Kenny responded, "Statistics and facts do matter, but the legend is always more powerful, endures longer, and appeals more to artists, poets, and ballad makers." It occurs to me just a few minutes ago that George Floyd has become the Horst Wessel of La Résistance. Horst Wessel was a street thug who was killed on the streets. He was a late convert to Nazism, and there was a famous song written about him, the Horst Wessel Lied. He was the great first hero of Nazism, and as I say, George Floyd, the career criminal who was turning his life around, but somehow found himself out of his mind on fentanyl and meth. And then he attempted to pass a counterfeit $20 bill, and then he resisted arrest twice and ended up dead. But now he has reached his apotheosis. as the religious people say. In fact, Father Jim Martin, S.J., explicitly compared him to no less than Jesus Christ. Now, I suggested the other day that the corporate CEOs of America, the corporate management of America, should be made to resign and give their positions to Black people. I mean, it's only just when one considers the horrible legacy of slavery, redlining, Jim Crow, and what they call the systemic racism that terrorizes Black people in America. This is only just. And I see that one man has stepped forward. Reddit co-founder Alexis Ohanian announced via Twitter on Friday that he's resigning from the Reddit board and urged the board to fill his seat with a Black candidate. A co-founder and CEO Steve Huffman subsequently said he and the Reddit board will honor Ohanian's request. Despite making significant progress over the years, we have to turn a mirror on ourselves and be willing to do the hard work of making sure we are living up to our values and our product and policies, Huffman wrote. Let's see. This Ohanian fellow is, I believe, married to a Black woman, Serena Williams, the behemoth tennis player who fled to a safe room when she was about to be tested for drugs. But no, she is a great American heroine of sport and beyond, certainly. I mean, she is a tremendous inspiration. So, St. George Floyd. Well, here's what President Donald Trump had to say. Equal justice under the law must mean that every American receives equal treatment in every encounter with law enforcement, regardless of race. Hopefully, George Floyd is looking down right now and saying this is a great thing that's happening for our country in terms of equality. Looking down, presumably looking down from heaven. Oh, yeah, okay. Pandering is one thing, but blasphemy is another. Battle Beagle at Harmless Yard Dog, excellent Twitter site, responds to a tweet by Trump. Sleepy Joe Biden's 1994 crime bill was a total disaster. It was mass incarceration for Black people, many of them innocent. I did criminal justice reform, something Obama and Biden didn't even try to do and couldn't do even if they did try. Biden can never escape his crime bill. And Battle Beagle has included a graph which shows the U.S. homicide rates from 1900 to 2015. And if we look at 1994, which was when the crime bill was passed, the homicide rate has reached almost 10 per 100,000. After the crime bill, it sinks like a stone. And in 2015, it is less than half what it was in 1994. Now, this is not all due to the crime bill. A great deal of it has to do with improved emergency medical techniques pioneered on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. So, pandering. Well, you know, it's one thing to pander, but I suppose if the gatekeepers don't like your pandering, then your pandering isn't going to be seen by all that many people. This is from the post-millennial. Twitter has decided to disable a tribute video to George Floyd made by President Trump's campaign team after an alleged copyright complaint. Curiously enough, the video still remains on YouTube without having been taken down for the reasons Twitter pointed out. The clip features a compilation of photos and videos of protesters marching down the street, as well as some instances of violence from rioters and looters, all while Trump gives a speech in the background. Trump also calls out rioters, looters, and anarchists, and even specifies the damage that Antifa and other far-left radical groups have done since the outbreak of this violence. This comes after Trump has made known his intention to designate Antifa as a terrorist group, which was followed by the announcement on June 3rd that the post-millennials Andy Ngo is suing Antifa for the assault done to him in the summer of 2019. Floyd's wrongful death on May 25th has not only led to massive protests and riots within the US, but it has spread globally. Twitter's decision to remove the video is the latest blow in an ongoing feud between the social media platform and the president, with Twitter fact-checking Trump's tweets while failing to uphold those same standards to other politicians on the platform. Yeah, there's a shocker. How many streets are going to be named after George Floyd? Will there be cities renamed after George Floyd? I mean, there's going to be George Floyd parks. There's going to be George Floyd statues all across America. Now, if we want to talk about stupidity, obviously the Washington Post cannot be ignored. It took 4 people to write this story. With White House effectively a fortress, some see Trump's strength, but others see weakness. The security perimeter around the White House keeps expanding. Tall black fencing is going up seemingly by the hour. Armed guards and sharpshooters and combat troops are omnipresent. In the 72 hours since Monday's melee, oh, it's a melee. That's a fancy French word for riot in this case at Lafayette Square. Well, Lafayette, French, so I guess it's appropriate. The White House has been transformed into a veritable fortress, the physical manifestation of President Trump's vision of law and order domination over the millions of Americans who have taken to the streets to protest racial injustice. Perhaps the reporters of the Washington Post are not very familiar with the English language. I'm just going to assume that, because otherwise I just have to accuse them of being bald-face liars. Putting up more and more barriers in front of the White House is not a physical manifestation of domination. It is the opposite. The White House, the Post continues, is now so heavily fortified that it resembles the monarchical palaces or authoritarian compounds of regimes in faraway lands, strikingly incongruous with the historic role of the Executive Mansion at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, which since its cornerstone was laid in 1792, has been known as the People's House. Do people use that term a lot? Not really. I don't really hear that all that often. And celebrated as an accessible symbol of American democracy. So Trump is a fascist dictator, but he is also weak. Again, this cognitive dissonance, this Schrodinger's cat of logic. Deborah Burke, dean of the Yale School of Architecture, said the White House barricaded as if it were a military base with multiple layers of black fencing surrounding the limestone Georgian structure conveys the opposite message and represents a physical violation of democracy. I think the need to fortify your house, and it's not his house, it's our house, shows weakness. The President of the United States should not feel threatened by his or her own citizens. Again, is Deborah Burke genuinely stupid, or is she a bald-faced liar? The reason that the White House has been fortified is because there were violent protests in front of it, with people attempting to storm the White House. And what a great many people want to happen is for rioters to get close enough to the White House that they have to be shot dead on the lawn. That's what these people are hoping for. And yet they carry on about weakness. Fortification is a defensive measure. It is not an offensive measure. But we live in the world of dullness now, in the world of stupidity. So this is the kind of reportage that we get. Let's go to the chat. YT says, a POC client rage quit on me today. Apparently I said something wrong as a white person. They've been emboldened. They're going to get vengeful. Things are going to get worse for us? Well, it depends on who you mean by us, I would say. Whether you're talking about members of the elite or everyone else. Things have been worse for us, if you will, for decades. Because the meme or the legend, if you will, that black people are afraid of white people is exactly the opposite of the truth. And every white person knows it, and every black person knows it as well. When two people are walking towards each other on a sidewalk, and one of them is white and one of them is black, and the white person decides to cut across the street to avoid the pass-by, who is the stronger and who is the weaker in this situation? For the memory of St. Floyd, yes, says MPO. Metal Mike says Trudeau was clutching a Black Lives Matter t-shirt today. He also took a knee on Capitol Hill, as well as his cabinet minister, Ahmed Hussein, who I will remind everyone is an illegal immigrant from Somalia who's been blubbing about all the discrimination that he suffered in my country. Mark it, June the 5th, 2020. This is the day that Canada officially died. I've been predicting for some years that Trudeau was eventually going to apologize for Canada's existence itself. And now we have reached that day. Matt Young says Floyd died of corona chant. Well, it's an interesting case because he had corona, but this was not listed as the cause of death, unlike many thousands, possibly tens of thousands of other cases in the United States. And you see how it would have been politically impossible for the coroner of Hennepin County to have listed COVID-19 as the cause of death because, well, he would have lost his job. The whole department would have been cleaned out. Mary Crow says, in a sane society, Kevin would be on TV making millions, fighting off the women. God bless you for your wisdom and sanity. Well, thank you so much. Too kind. Dawn from Beyond says, this BLM stuff drives me crazy as I contemplate the fact that whiteys are a tiny minority on this earth. Yes, 11%. Blacks, browns, and yellows are a huge majority. For example, the population of Africa is 1.2 billion. Let's see. Dawn from Beyond, I just want my people to survive and thrive. Well, again, when we talk about the people, and I mentioned Reddit, because, look, the ordinary white people of America have got it in the neck for decades. And now it appears that it's time for the elites to get it in the neck. And that can only be a good thing. William Hicks says, if systemic racism is the issue, how can the officers who killed George Floyd be held responsible for his death? Did the system kill him or did they? No one has put forward any evidence that the lead officer, the one with the infamous knee, was motivated by racism. There's been no evidence adduced to this effect, but it doesn't matter. But again, just think of Schrödinger's cat. Metal Mike says, I'm hearing rumors that this weekend's Million Man March will be used by the deep state to overthrow Trump. I'll be getting to that. Yes, as I said earlier, this is the third coup attempt. And as they say, third time's a charm. Okay. Glib Medley says, David Dorn was murdered on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Well, I could make the Chris Rock joke, but, I'm not going to do that because, people get in trouble. White people get in very serious trouble for repeating Chris Rock's joke. Ricardo Williams says, I've been arrested. It was still a pleasant experience. I asked him if the handcuffs were really necessary, and he was a real mensch for taking them off. David Wright says, aren't we truly and fully in San Francisco's narco-tyranny world? Well, we've been in that world for decades. white people are harassed over trifles. And as Sam Francis pointed out, 25 years ago, that the police know that there are large caches of weapons and ammunition in apartments all over America's cities, but they make no move on them because they're afraid, well, of possible violent response, and they're afraid of the riots that would follow, because for many Black people in the inner city, gangsters are heroes. You know, I'm reminded of that great movie Slapshot, where Paul Newman is bailing out the Hanson brothers, and he says, "You can't keep them in jail. They're folk heroes." And the police officer says, "They're criminals." And Paul Newman says, "All folk heroes started off as criminals." And there's a lot of truth to that. Eternal Fisherman says, "We apologize for how we founded the US and Canada. Now let's take another 100 million immigrants." Yes, I was thinking about that. That there's going to be a push now that obviously the solution to Black problems is to have many, many millions more Black people. Okay. Manfred von Thistlebaum says, "I believe their ultimate goal is a police state. Everything going on is leading to that." Yeah, but you see, they've opened Pandora's box here, and they have shown the weakness of government. I mean, what's the point of having these laws? What's the point of having the National Guard if the National Guard is going to be used? And I'm going to be talking about some of the stupidity coming from historians on this question. Okay, so let's see. Is John Kelly joining the generals' mutiny? Former chief of staff calls Donald Trump nasty and confused over attack on Jim Mattis, and lines up interview with Trump-hating mooch. That would be Anthony Scaramucci. Yes, once again, 7 days in June. All of the generals are getting together. And why would they do that? Well, as I suggested earlier this week, military intelligence, intelligence in the United States has been entirely militarized now. It's been taken out of the hands of civilians, and it's all the boys in uniform that are responsible. And the boys in uniform got some splaining to do about what went on under President Obama with General Michael Hayden, who apparently is now a hero of La Resistance, saying, that it turns out that he's the one who was in charge of surveilling all Americans. And of course, there is their flagrantly illegal attempt to destroy the candidacy of Donald Trump in 2016. So the generals are, they're employing a well-known military maneuver. It's called CYA, cover your ass. Joe Biden, who apparently is still running for president, he just can't help himself. He said, "It's about the attitude of the country. Do we want our kids? Do we really think that this is good as we can be as a nation?" Did he get that from the Gillette ad? I don't think the vast majority of people think that. There are probably anywhere from 10 to 15% of the people out there that are just not very good people, but that's not who we are. The vast majority of people are decent. 10 to 15%. Does that match up pretty closely to a well-known demographic in the United States? Just a shocking statement there by Joe Biden. How dare he? Let's see. This is from DNYUZ. I still don't know what that stands for. The agonizing question, is New York City worth it anymore? Now, I suppose there's going to be people cheering at the exodus from New York City, which has already begun. They should not be cheering. They should be grieving. Because what these people, these refugees from New York, are going to do is they're going to spread their paws all over America. They're going to pause parts of America that are not yet paused. In the same way that refugees from New York State paused Vermont, that refugees from Massachusetts paused New Hampshire, that refugees from California paused Colorado. This is what we're looking for. The pandemic was already wearing on Lynn Miller Lockman, a children's book author and translator who lives in the East Village. My husband and I love New York City. She said, we sacrificed a lot to be here. It's always about them. They made a tremendous sacrifice. For Ms. Miller Lockman, 63, the chaos of the past week has shown us that freedoms we've come to take for granted in this country may not be there for us. We're watching the warning signs. It's a decision that must be made individually and privately, one that some 420,000 New Yorkers with the resources to do so had already made between March and May in reaction to the pandemic. But it's also a decision that has fueled collective judgment. If you say you love New York, City patriots reckon, how could you leave it when the going gets tough? Well, I suppose part of it is that a great many people in New York don't come from New York. New York is one of the most deracinated places in the world. Rebecca Rossler, a therapist and doula, decided to leave even though her family history in New York goes back to the 1870s. I love the city more than anything, Miss Rossler, 40, said. But on March 24th, she fled her two-bedroom home in Stuyvesant Town with her husband and their children, a 4-year-old and 2-year-old twins. They broke their lease and are searching for a new home in Connecticut. Well, Connecticut was paused a long time ago, so if all the New Yorkers moved to Connecticut, well, I suppose that wouldn't change things too much. I hate to admit it, but I do feel that if you don't want to be here so long, I wish you the best of luck and goodbye, said Joseph Holmes, a photographer in, wait for it, Park Slope, Brooklyn, who moved to New York City in 1984. These times of crisis, when things get tough in the city, it's where I want to be. It's where my neighbors are. He especially takes offense to people saying they don't want to be in the city if the museums, galleries, bars, and restaurants are closed. That is the main reason why people say that they have moved to New York or they want to move to New York. I don't really understand that whole attitude that says the attractions are shut down. Why would I want to be here? These are people who already had one foot out of the door. I've been walking around and exploring, and the city is becoming even more fascinating during a time like this. That includes the protests. I'm glad to live at the center of that kind of action. Yeah, you had plenty of that action when Dinkins was mayor. Golly, that was a fun time, wasn't it? I remember a Saturday Night Live skit about this when crime had reached its worst, that someone confesses to a bunch of other people that he got mugged. Well, how is it that you got mugged? And blah, 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 blah. And I looked at him. Oh, you made eye contact. You never, ever make eye contact. That's the joke. The joke is that back in those days, New Yorkers were so terrified of the racaille, as the French call it, that you couldn't look people in the eye, well, certain people in the eye, because then you would be robbed with force. Mugged is the cute name for it. Yeah, so poor New York City. Again, on the topic of New York, how about that New York Times? It would be terrible. It would be terrible if the New York Times were torn to pieces, wouldn't it? Senator Tom Cotton, he tweets, "Attention New York Times, I'd like to report an editorial that violates your new policy against publishing editorials that are, quote, contemptuous in tone," unquote. And the op-ed in question is by Michelle Goldberg, who is one of the New York Times House conservatives, and it is titled Tom Cotton's Fascist Op-Ed. Now, I can point out that fascism died in flames in 1945, but as George Orwell pointed out, I believe in 1947, that fascism simply means something we don't like. How should opinion pages respond to the right's authoritarian turn? Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. You see, the New York Times ran a screed, according to the estimable Michelle Goldberg, arguing that the military should be sent to American cities to restore order, which has caused a rebellion inside the New York Times. And Cotton, very, 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 very bad people that he represents, fascism. It's always apparently it's always coming to the fore in America, as Tom Wolfe pointed out, 1960s? As David French, and I'll be getting to him later, a conservative writer who is like Cotton, a veteran of the war in Iraq, pointed out, no quarter orders, which means showing the enemy no mercy, even if they try to surrender, are a war crime. She is deliberately misinterpreting what Trump said, but never mind that. So it's not contemptuous to call someone a fascist for calling for a return to order. Again, more of this dullness or rank stupidity of which Alexander Pope complained. So, yeah, fascist. From the Daily Beast, New York Times executives take turns apologizing to quell staff revolt. In a tense staff meeting, the paper admitted to inviting Senator Cotton to read the Send in the Troops column and said it will overhaul the frequently controversial opinion page. And what that means is that it will be all Prague all the time. The New York Times apologized to its staff on Friday in a lengthy, tense meeting in which the paper's top editor strongly suggested they will overhaul the oft controversial. Yes, you wouldn't want an opinion page to be controversial. Okay, so there's a whole lot of CYA from the New York Times. I didn't really read it. Oh, aren't you paid for being an editor? That sort of thing. James Bennett, the top opinion editor, said that he let his section be stampeded by the news cycle. I would think that the New York Times is often stampeded by the news cycle. It is a daily news paper. And, difficult decisions have to be made every single day, but I guess it was just too overwhelming for James Bennett. Perhaps he should quit his job and, do something useful like raise peacocks. I just want to begin by saying I'm very sorry. I'm sorry for the pain that this particular piece has caused. I do think this is a moment for me and for us to interrogate everything we do in opinion. Interrogate? Ew. I don't like the tone of that. When asked why he did not personally read Cotton's column before publishing, Bennett said it was another part of the process that broke down. He added, I should have been involved in signing off on the piece. I should have read it and signed off. It is titled Send in the Troops. Perhaps that gave a little flavor of what was in the op-ed. The paper's executive editor, Dean Beckett, meanwhile, said he was impressed and proud of the Solidarity Times staffers showed each other following the publication of the op-ed, telling staff he stayed up all night following its publication on Wednesday, reading their comments. Oh, so it's a communist institution now, is it? They have political commissar there? Or a whole bunch of political commissars? According to Jonathan Swan, more than 160 New York Times employees planned a virtual walkout for Friday morning over the Senator Tom Cotton op-ed. Yeah, they logged off, apparently. There are literally tens of thousands of journalists in the United States who would cheerfully work for the New York Times for half of what these people are paying. But the New York Times isn't going to fire them for insubordination. Why not? Are these journalists? Are they going to tear down the New York Times building? My, they're easily frightened bunch, journalistic executives. Crystal Ball tweets, yes, her name is actually Crystal Ball, and one has to blame her father for this poor woman's life, Because, a name is being marked for life. And when you have a stupid goofball name like Crystal Ball, I suppose a lot can be forgiven. Anyway, she tweets, my husband asked a Secret Service agent guarding the Treasury whether he ever thought he'd see this, which is the U.S. Treasury building defaced repeatedly with very large graffiti. He said, I'm surprised it took this long. I think I'm going to see the whole building burned down. 40% unemployment. So Crystal Ball she's a revolutionary. Is she? Well, Crystal Ball is kind of like America's Michael Corrin. She's this, then she's that, then she is the other. She ran for Congress in 2010 in Virginia. She lost some very embarrassing photos of her wearing some, how shall I say, phallic accoutrements or engaging with phallic accoutrements became publicized, which was sexism. So then Trump gets elected, and guess what? She's populist now. But before that, in 2017, she set up a PAC, which benefited her greatly. She paid herself more than a third of that, $174,000 in salary. But then she moves to the right, and she's against those Democrats, reversing the apocalypse, hijacking the Democratic Party to save the world, which was published, 3 years ago. Oh, but she supported Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. I don't know. Sometimes I think that it's impossible to take seriously a woman's opinions on politics because they are so enamored of consensus. Prove me wrong, people. We continually hear that what Trump is doing, or what he has threatened to do, is unprecedented in American history. It is very much not unprecedented in American history. But these clowns who dominate the media and dominate academia, they don't know much about American history, and they don't care that, George Washington has been talked about a lot lately. Now, I thought George Washington was an evil slaveholder, but he's useful in certain circumstances. Now, was there ever a rebellion? George Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion. Yes. You can look that up. This was a rebellion against taxation of rum and whiskey. It was a very serious thing. It lasted 3 years, and it was put down by force of arms. And the arms were led by no less than George Washington himself, the father of the country, who led the militia from the field. So what Donald Trump is suggesting is in no way contrary to the spirit of George Washington. I've heard, when we're talking about stupidity, there's a cartoonist called Matt Bors. It's useful to read people like him because what does the left want for us? Oh, here's a cartoon that he did today. This is Trump. I'm declaring war on Antifa. I will destroy the anti-fascist movement with tremendous force. Police are abolished. We're melting down all the guns. MAGA is over. My white power death cult is canceled. And as for me, I officially resign. And then the White House blows up. And some white guy says, wow, I guess we should disband. And the black guy, because the black people are always the voice of reason, says, hey, keep your mask on. Earlier this week, he said that the police should all be fired and forced to pick up garbage. Now, he's the lunatic fringe, right? Yeah, in revolutionary times, the lunatic fringe has a habit of becoming the new center. David French is, he's in love with the black people now, particularly the black people on sports TV. And he tweeted some Black Lives Matter speech. I love this, from Turner Sports EJ. Inspiring and true. Thank you. To which my response was, Major David French, 1st Cock Division, reporting for duty, sir. Oh, and his wife, Nancy French, who's a ghostwriter. And she wrote a paean, ghostwrote a paean to one of Sarah Palin's slutty daughters, the one who keeps getting knocked up. Yeah. Conservatism at work. So she tweeted, Sufjan Stevens, he's an alternative rock star, posted this to his Instagram account with the caption, Philippians 2:3. In case you aren't familiar, the verse reads, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. And there is an illustration, and it's a black box with white type that says, Black Lives Matter more than yours. This is official from the true conservatives. Black Lives Matter more than yours. Again, this woman seems to be ignorant of history. I responded to her, a word to the wise. Louis Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans, supported the revolution wholeheartedly. He voted for the execution of Louis XVI, his cousin, and even changed his name to Philippe Égalité. You won't believe what happened next. Well, I'll give you the spoiler. He was condemned to death by the Jacobins that he had sucked up to, and went to the guillotine, like so many others of the nobility who had served the revolution in an attempt to both virtue signal and save their skin. Jennifer Rubin, who is one of the resident conservatives at the Washington Post, she said in response to this imbroglio at the New York Times, the New York Times can publish whatever it wishes at a time the administration is contemplating unconstitutional use of violence against innocents on the anniversary of Tiananmen. It is wholly irresponsible. Sorry to say, but who the fuck are we to tell AA employee to pipe down? And I responded, AA employee? AA, of course, stands for affirmative action. Are you suggesting that the people of color employees of the New York Times are anything less than fully qualified? Check your privilege. Black Lives Matter. Yes, Joshua Zeitz, historian here, a head of state using a standing army to occupy an American city, compel citizens off the street, stifle free expression and assembly, using paramilitary forces to smoke clergy out of their churches at the head of the state's whim, is pretty much the founder's nightmare. And Conrad Stump responded, yeah, LOL, yeah, George Washington would have never done anything to put down an insurrection. Of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to put down an insurrection, actually somewhat less of an insurrection than the Whiskey Rebellion. It was a camp, the bonus camp. It was dispersed with force. And the Columbia Bugle responds, the Insurrection Act was signed into law by 1807 by President Thomas Jefferson, a founding father. Tom Holland, the historian, has written some excellent books. He asks some interesting questions before he goes into his pro forma denunciation of Trump. Why has the death of a man across the Atlantic at the hands of a police force equipped with immeasurably more guns than our own in a country with a very different history of race relations become a topic of such consuming interest in Britain? It is not as though the United States is the only superpower in which terrible things are currently happening. Why, if people in Britain feel that they have a moral responsibility to march against Donald Trump, are they not also breaking the lockdown to protest the crushing of liberty in Hong Kong, a city that was, unlike America, a British colony as recently as 1997? Why, when the death of a black man in Minneapolis can provoke such anguish among minorities here, has the detention of 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang and a systematic attempt by the Chinese government at cultural genocide failed to provoke a marching storm. Well, he says that Britain has been in hock now to American narratives for at least a century. And this is, to a large extent, is certainly true of my country, but it is generally true all over the world. In fact, the new right, the new libertarian right, famous book, Without Marx or Jesus, we should be more like America. We need to be more like America. We need to put our Frenchness behind us and be more like America. Well, I guess they are more like America, in which they have a continuous race war going on in the streets of France. Oh, yes, is Stupidity, NFL division. Saints quarterback Drew Brees has issued a second apology for his widely criticized comments, likening kneeling during the national anthem to disrespecting America. Brees posted a video on Instagram looking into the camera, saying again that he's sorry and promising to work for change. Quote, I know there's not much I can say that would make things better right now, so why don't you just shut up? But I just want you to see in my eyes how sorry I am for the comments I made yesterday. I am sorry, and I will do better, and I will be part of the solution, and I am your ally. Well, you know, I'm going to use some profanity here, and I've said this with regards to Tiger Woods and his grotesque humiliation at his own hands at that infamous news conference. Does fuck you money mean nothing? Drew Brees has been paid, close to $100 million in his NFL career. He owns, seven, what do they call it, Jimmy John's restaurants, and he has multiple other business ventures. He's 41 years old. Does he believe that he's going to play another game for the New Orleans Saints? There was a white quarterback who got into some difficulty with black teammates. I believe it was on the Raiders a few years ago. And they made it clear who was in charge, because they simply stopped trying to defend the rush, and the quarterback got hammered again and again and again. And that will happen to Drew Brees, and he's 41 years old now. Also, his receivers will become strangely unable to catch passes which land on their number. They will just keep bouncing off. So I don't know why Drew Brees would do this. All must kneel. NFL players send video telling league, we will not be silenced. And again, I think this is a good thing, because I think that sports has replaced religion as the opiate of the people. And a great many Americans worship men who hate their guts, who have no regard for them at all. NFL players are among the most entitled people in America. They are well paid, mostly for physical attributes. I'm not denigrating the effort and the training that goes into this. But of course, I was reading about Doug Flutie the other day, and he was 5'8", and now they're saying that the quarterbacks that are 6 feet tall, or maybe 6'1" or 6'2", are too short for the NFL. It is a game of behemoths. And what happens to these people when they retire? All so frequently, hand on the shoulder, how'd you like to go into the booth? Well, I don't have any broadcasting experience. Don't worry about it. You'll learn on the job. A group of NFL players released a powerful video this week calling on the sports league to support black players, call out racism, and admit wrong in silencing our players from peacefully protesting amid the death of St. George Floyd. Quote, it's been 10 days since George Floyd was brutally murdered. How many times do we need to ask you to listen to our players? What will it take for one of us to be murdered by police brutality? Ooh, I don't know, sailing pretty close to the wind. How many people have NFL players murdered or raped, say, or brutally beaten? Quite a few. That's why they call it the National Felons League. What if I was George Floyd? Football stars taking part included, I'm not going to read those names. New Orleans Saints wide receiver Michael Thomas, who criticized Drew Brees this week, was also in the video. Quote, I am George Floyd. I am Breonna Taylor. I am Ahmaud Arbery. I am Eric Garner, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. You're comparing yourself to George Floyd? You millionaires with your salary and your shoe endorsements and all your other endorsements, you're comparing yourself to someone like George Floyd? Very amusing. Very amusing indeed. In fact, NFL players, they get away with things that would put ordinary black people in prison for many years. NFL players get away with this on a regular basis because of their status. Yes, Justin Trudeau takes a knee at anti-racism protest at Parliament Hill. Yeah, I don't know how much I can say about this. You are either a racist or an anti-racist, a speaker said. That's the binary division that people are going to trap us in. Racism is not a term of any efficacy, and as Peter Simple said, should always be spelled within inverted commas. Trudeau gave a similar response when the people started chanting Black Lives Matter. Blacks are 3.2% of the Canadian population. In 1971, there were precisely 34,400 blacks in all of Canada, which at that time had a population of 21 million. There is no black history to speak of in my country, but everyone is pretending otherwise. And the ultra-right-wing Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has decided to convene what can only be called an anti-racism commissariat. Well, racists or would-be racists are going to be hunted down in Ontario, which is Canada's most populous province. The Washington Monument was hit by lightning. Very spectacular. In the past, people would have seen this as a sign and a wonder. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it is. We shall have to see. But, after when John Paul II was Pope, when he allowed pagan idols to be put on the altar of St. Francis's own church in Assisi, and this happened twice, and the church was leveled by an earthquake, John Paul II did not see any significance in this. Macy's biggest jobs increase ever of 2.5 million as economy starts to recover from corona virus. The unemployment rate fell to 13.3%, which in recent terms is catastrophic. It was under 5% under Trump. A good point here made by Jim Cramer. The pandemic led to one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. The bigger the business, the more it moves the major averages, and that matters because this is the first recession where big business is coming through virtually unscathed. I think we're looking at a V-shaped recovery in the stock market, and that has almost nothing to do with a V-shaped recovery in the economy. It was planned that way because under capitalism 2.0, profits are privatized and costs are socialized. And, Mr. Main Street is going to have to pay for this because we wouldn't, the bankers are all expecting, new Audis this year. They couldn't possibly go, one more year with the old one. And it would be cruel to deny them this. There's also that, third house that they're constructing in Bermuda. I mean, come on. What kind of monster would deny the bankers that? Rather sobering column today. Let's go. Well, let me go to the chat. I'm going to be going to the book club in about 25 minutes. So let's go to the chat here. See what people are saying. Achogokin666 says Mayor of Minneapolis really turned on the waterworks. Yeah, he kept it going for a long, long time. At least a minute. Matt Young says George Floyd died for our sins. Well, not our sins, because Black lives matter more than yours. We have that from David French's wife. So this is This is the gospel. The gospel. Mike F. says, in 100 years, George Floyd will be known as one of the greatest people to have ever lived. Lecomte de Berea says, no looting in Canada, though. Well, there has been looting in Montreal. Serious looting in Montreal. But I guess if you shutter your store and you board it up, thus taking yourself out of business, then that makes it much more difficult for looters. But I think there's going to be looting. I think there's going to be quite considerable looting. Because, I mean, it's been promised, you know. Matt Young says Trump finally built the wall, but it's around the White House. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Tom Anderson says, KMG, please sponsor a visa so I can live in Canada. America's collapsing. Canada is about 10 to 20 years behind the United States. And it is an unfortunate attribute of our nation that every stupid idea or trend from the United States is immediately adopted as a defining Canadian characteristic. Metal Mike says, if Trudeau is protesting against systemic racism in Canada, he's in charge of the country, so he's protesting against himself. That's absolutely true. And I made the same point about Obama, who was president for 8 years, and George W. Bush, who was president for 8 years. What did they do to stem this tide of righteous black rage? No, it doesn't matter. They're not responsible for what they did. I suppose George W. Bush got all teary-eyed after Kanye West said that he didn't like black people. Don from Beyond says, have all you guys seen the red and blue map election results in the third dimension? Funny how the blue city states are precisely where the riots are happening. Well, that's what one would expect, you know. Jeffrey Neal says, whites must be careful with any statements or the media and BLM supporters will play whack-a-mole with your career. That is absolutely true. I don't have a career, so I don't have to worry about it. Others are not so lucky, I suppose. Chogakin 666, DC mayor, huge Black Lives street painting. No, it goes on for blocks. It goes on for blocks and blocks. Are you going to talk about the rumors of the coup? Well, I have been talking about it a little. I mean, we seem to have a whole bunch of generals on board. Of course, you know, Trump does have the special forces. The special forces answer only to the president of the United States. They are his Praetorian Guard, if you will. Well, I just kind of wonder how this coup would work. Are they going to actually, you know, send an army division to the White House and demand he resign? I mean, that's typically how it works. That's what happened to President Diem in South Vietnam, which I'm going to talk about during the book club. The army shows up. They promise clemency if you leave. Diem would not leave, and so his guard was mowed down. He was taken. He was captured. He and his brother were captured, and they were both shot in the head and bayoneted at the express order of President John F. Kennedy, the well-known humanitarian and fellow Roman Catholic. Is America finished, or can it be salvaged? No, I don't think that it's finished. I mean, the situation is very fluid here. We haven't seen a counterattack. We may not see a counterattack. That's the point. They're going to march on D.C. tomorrow, hence the current narrative of mock constitutional rights. Are they going to attempt to storm the White House? Are they going to attempt to storm the Capitol building, storm the Supreme Court, storm the Eisenhower building, storm the FBI building, etc., etc.? Well, that will certainly be interesting to see. Now, if there are attempts made to storm any of these buildings and there is not a significant police response, well, then obviously all bets are off. Because if it's really that easy to take over the United States, then you're going to see efforts to take over the United States. I wondered about this. I wondered about this for the longest time. I joked a couple of months ago that such as the state and the condition of the Canadian military that it's likely that 200 men with 22 rifles could take Ottawa. But it's a question of will. It always comes down to a question of will. You know, after 2001, I started thinking about the situation in the United States and, the prospects for terror. And I came up with a scenario, which was, imagine every Friday, which is the holiest day for Muslims, there is an atrocity in the United States. For instance, food court malls or theaters or whatever, or, men with guns, men with rifles, take these places and they just start killing people wildly. If you can find people who are willing to give up their lives for this, yeah. My supposition, my guess was that after like week 3 or 4, the entire United States would be in an utter panic. An utter panic. Because what are they going to do about this? There are hard measures that could be taken, but would they be up? Would the authorities be up to taking them? Because as I say, when you look at the great moments in history, they all come down to a question of will. And the rioters in the streets have shown the will, but the authorities have not shown a will. It may come. It's not too late. So the Z-Man has a very sobering column today. He writes about the current calls to end the police. The conventional conservatives are responding like the trained dogs they are by rushing to defend the police state and the police themselves. Many are combining the effort to prove the Democrats are the real racists with their defense of the police state by finding black cops to hold up as heroes. That sheriff from Washington who wears the cowboy hat on TV must be very busy right now. He's a superhero. The thing is, this system cannot survive a month without the cops. Take the cops off the streets, and the mob consumes the beautiful people neighborhoods. The usual suspects will be swallowing their jewelry and racing to the borders. All of the petty tyrants that have been pushing us around for the last 2 months over the ridiculous virus panic will be swinging from lampposts. Not only will the mob lay waste to the people in charge, the normal people quietly seething will be suddenly unconstrained. It is something that goes unremarked, but the cops exist to defend the rich people and the ruling class. Anarcho-tyranny is impossible without the cops. They are assigned to hassle normal people over petty things. They are the ones harassing normal people while making sure the spaghetti-armed Antifa types are safe. Go out this weekend and visit ruling class areas or your government buildings. They will have a full police presence while the mob goes crazy in the cities. This is what is important about these calls to end the police. It is a sign that the people in charge want to be put out of their misery. Their self-hatred often manifests as hatred of us, but in reality is hatred of self that is driving them. They hate themselves, so they hate the world around them, and they hate their ancestors who made it possible. This zeal to erase the past and destroy the present is a form of self-abnegation. They wish to erase their hated self as an extreme act of contrition. No one should prevent them from doing it. We're long past the point of defending society from the lunatics. Let them deal with this golem they created. It would be endlessly amusing seeing the mob chasing the beautiful people around in their burning neighborhoods. Imagine the cast of the cable chat shows being forced to grovel and plead to a mob of gentle giants. My goodness, that would be the best television those people made in their lifetimes. Now, going back to the idea of anarcho-tyranny, this has a profoundly alienating effect on the majority because we're constantly hearing about how white people are hunting down black people, whereas everyone knows that is the exact opposite of the truth. Horrendous atrocities are perpetrated against white people in the United States, and the media decides alternately to ignore it or to claim that it didn't happen, or to claim that the white people somehow brought this on themselves. Oh, a home invasion, which leads to torture, rape, and slow killing. What could have possibly brought that on? The N-word? You've noticed this going on for decades. Some man goes crazy on Long Island, say. He kills eight white people. Oh, well, the N-word must have been said. Now, the alienating effect that this has on the majority is that they increasingly come to believe, who cares? Why should anyone risk anything to save a society as rotten as this? There are no-go areas all over America, but that word, that expression is not used in the United States. You know, it's used in Sweden and France and elsewhere, but not in the United States. That white people in America know that it is a mug's game to offend black people in any way, by dissing them, perhaps by looking at them. You know, this can lead to deadly violence. But apparently it is white people who are chasing down black people, as the legend of George Floyd proves. But, you know, yesterday, I didn't mention it, but Herbert Stein, who was an economist and the chairman of Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors, he said that there's many versions of this, that systems continue until they stop. And this might be the case. That there's many people, including myself, who have been saying for quite some time that the present system is unsustainable. Well, maybe this is the point where it won't be sustained any longer. Oh, Alex Salvi reports the president of the Minneapolis City Council says the city's police department will be dismantled and replaced with a transformative new model of public safety. Again, you know, with this march on Washington, it would be a shame if this march were to reach Georgetown. That would just be a terrible, terrible, terrible shame. Alyssa Rosenberg, and who is Alyssa Rosenberg when she's at home? Let's see. Oh, she writes for the Washington Post, and she's the Across the Movie Aisle co-host. How about that? Oh, and she's married to Matt Gertz. And who is Matt Gertz? He's a senior fellow at, Media Matters for America. Okay. So Alyssa Rosenberg tweets, if Hollywood is serious about combating police brutality, it will pause production on every police procedural and movie and take a hard look at the stories it's telling. Dullness, stupidity, Steve Saylor responded, have you really thought through your demand for more realistic cop shows on TV? That would mean, for instance, that Law and Order would have to replace 95% of its shows about rich white criminal masterminds with shows about poor black knucklehead murderers. You know, when you look into black murders in the United States, and we're talking about black on black murders, one's jaw drops because you murdered someone else over that? You murdered someone else over a buck? I wrote about a story where someone was killed over $1. Oh, yeah, someone was wearing the wrong color shirt. Not a gang member, just wearing the wrong color shirt. And so you get arrested. And what do you say? Got to represent. Well, that's certainly a good idea. You know, for killing someone and then spending, I don't know, the next, 15, 20 years in prison. Excellent idea. Why is this coup happening now? Well, I mentioned the militarization of intelligence, and Eli Lake has an excellent story in Bloomberg. The FBI's investigation into Trump and Russia now looks even worse. Rod Rosenstein says he was kept in the dark about important parts of the probe. Late last year, the Justice Department's Inspector General found the Bureau's application to eavesdrop on a former aide to then-candidate Donald Trump's campaign was riddled with factual errors and omissions. The surveillance court that approved that warrant had barred the agents who submitted it from appearing before it. And last month, the Justice Department dropped its case against former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. On Wednesday, things got worse. In testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein said that all of the irregularities and shortcuts exposed in recent Justice Department reviews were kept from him when he signed the warrant applications into that campaign aide Carter Page. Had he known about them at the time, he said he never would have signed them. Rosenstein even reluctantly acknowledged that his own August 2017 memo specifying the parameters of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation was deeply flawed. By August 2017, it was clear there was no support for the whole concept that the campaign was colluding with the Russians, said Senator Lindsey Graham. There was no there. I agree with that general statement, Rosenstein responded. In normal times, Lake comments, this would be a bombshell. Rosenstein's memo listed the alleged crimes that Mueller's team was investigating. Rosenstein said that Mueller's office helped him draft it. This reflects poorly on Rosenstein. Yes, it does. As the most senior Justice Department official overseeing the Mueller investigation, his job was to check its work. He didn't. This also reflects poorly on the FBI. The Bureau knew, for example, that the opposition research dossier in which it relied to seek the Page warrant was not reliable. The Inspector General concluded that none of the unique information in the dossier was corroborated. It doesn't stop there. Rosenstein also acknowledged that the FBI never shared its draft memo from January 2017 to close the counterintelligence investigation into Flynn. That investigation was kept open after former FBI Director James Comey discovered Flynn's calls with Russia ambassador at the end of 2016. How did they discover this? Because they had wiretapped him. While such communications would be unusual for most private citizens, the calls were routine for an incoming national security advisor. Rosenstein also said that exculpatory information collected from FBI informant approaches to the investigation's targets were not shared with him. Add it all up, and it's clear that the FBI investigation into the Trump campaign's alleged coordination with Russia was out of control. It's my view that this coup attempt that's ongoing is a desperate attempt to stop the revelation of certain information, certain shocking information. That is to say that the deep state is completely out of control and has been running a government, an illegal government within a government which, this illegal government, which we now find considered itself to be superior and more legitimate than the the administration of the democratically elected president, Donald Trump. These people are looking at being ruined. Socially ruined, financially ruined. A great many of them are looking at going to prison. And they're also facing the destruction of the entire national intelligence system. And so they will fight it in any way that they can, including bringing down the President of the United States. You remember a certain conspiracy theory that you weren't allowed to talk about? Well, this is from the Daily Mail, and people are talking about it. The former chief of MI6 has claimed that the coronavirus escaped from a lab in China by accident. Sir Richard Dearlove, who is the head of MI6, a role known informally as C from 1999 to 2004, said he believes that COVID-19 is man-made. He cited an important report from Professor Angus Dalgleish of St. George's Hospital, University of London, and Norwegian virologist Birger Sorensen, which claims the virus was manufactured in a laboratory. In the report, scientists claim to have identified inserted sections placed on the SARS-CoV-2 spike surface, which the virus uses to attach onto cells, and observed that they were, quote, significantly different from any SARS we have studied, unquote. Now, another reason for the coup attempt is that the deep state, and well, the 1% in particular, they love China because it makes them a lot of money. And if China is going to be brought down by this virus, well, they're in serious trouble. There's also the question of just how much Chinese infiltration there has been in the United States, in academia, in government, in the media, in the intelligence services themselves. And it's not in the deep state's interest for people to know about this. Let's see, Toby Young writes in Lockdown Skeptics, Black Lives Matter, rank hypocrisy doesn't. Last Sunday, I pointed out the rank hypocrisy of progressive journalists and the mainstream media wholeheartedly endorsing the Black Lives Matter protests, in spite of depicting Dominic Cummings as the Antichrist a couple of weeks ago because he drove to his parents' house in Durham. But if you think that was an example of hypocrisy on steroids, get a load of this. More than 1,200 U.S. public health professionals have written an open letter supporting the protests. Yes, these are the very same panjandrums who were ordering us to stay at home to flatten the curve until about 5 minutes ago. As David Bernstein writes in Reason, quote, remember when all the politicians and talking heads were telling us we had to listen to the allegedly unanimous opinion of public health experts that nothing, literally nothing, was more important than social distancing to prevent the spread of coronavirus, and that anyone who raised objections to the scope or persistence of lockdowns was a misanthropic, anti-science troglodyte? That was yesterday. Today, protesting against racism is more important, unquote. A friend of mine who supported the lockdowns until now is absolutely flabbergasted by this volte-face. I'm sort of used to PC craziness, but this is among the most insane things I've ever seen. I'm actually struggling to get my head around it. Okay, these public health experts, they're just politicians. And epidemiology is simply the study of correlation. That's all it is. But now the epidemiologists, they are the supreme leaders of medicine. All they do is study correlation. But again, you see how the zeitgeist is easily manipulated, that we are all in this together. We are all in this together. Social distancing, Black Lives Matter. Oh, we've moved on. Have we? Oh, just like that? Yeah. Just like that. A few words about my own country before we move to the book club. Ahmed Hussein, who is a self-admitted illegal immigrant, and there's a long, loving profile of him from the New York Times, no less, at the time that he became immigration minister, 4 years ago, where he cheerfully admits that he simply got on a plane from Kenya to Canada. He had no permission to come to my country. He's an illegal immigrant. He's been talking, Hussein has been poor-mouthing. I've been followed in stores. Instinctively, my back gets up when a police cruiser comes behind me as I drive. Now, Randy Hillier, who was formerly a Conservative member of the Ontario legislature, was kicked out by the Conservative Party because they're cucks. He tweeted, a guilty conscience? Don Braid of the Calgary Herald was deeply, deeply wounded by this. The empathy vacuum, the denial of racism, the hint that the black victim must be a criminal, they turn the stomach. Even worse was the response to Hussein from Ed Amar, longtime Alberta Conservative and founding chairman of Premier Jason Kenney's United Conservative Party. Amar said to Hussein on Twitter, don't bring this to Canada, you fucking loser. Amar, of course, apologized. And he explained that as an immigrant from a persecuted minority in Lebanon, I'm well aware of the ugly face of discrimination, having lived it firsthand. Hussein wasn't importing anything, though, says Don Bragg. Yes, he is. This is not Somalia. Canada has been, for most of its history, was mercifully free of the race problems that have dogged the United States. And there is a certain element in my country, now triumphant, which is determined to make Canada just as dysfunctional in terms of race relations as the United States is. And the elite cheers this because they want to be like the Americans. Oh, come on. How come we don't have riots in the streets? How come we don't have the downtown being burned down? What are we, squares or something? Have we been left behind by history? Stockwell Day, who I knew a little back in the day when he was an Alberta cabinet minister, became he was the leader of, I won't get into the complications about the right in Canada, but he was the leader of a political party which eventually was subsumed by the Conservative Party of Canada. He became a cabinet minister. He was cabinet minister for many years. Stephen Harper's government was defeated, so he quit politics. Despite the rules against lobbying, don't call him a lobbyist. He's a consultant, and it's not at all the same thing. He was hired by one of Canada's top law firms, Macmillan LLP, despite the fact that he does not have a law degree. And he was on the board of TELUS, which is one of Canada's semi-monopoly telecommunications companies. And he was also on regular panelist on the CBC. Now, he was asked about George Floyd because St. George Floyd is for some reason the #1 topic in Canada. And he said that systemic racism was not an issue in Canada and compared people's experiences of racism here to him being mocked for wearing glasses as a child. It was a silly thing to do. Obviously, there's no systemic racism in this country. If there were systemic racism, the governments of our country, both liberal and conservative, wouldn't be hell-bent on replacing whites with non-whites. I mean, that should settle the argument right there. So we'll take a very quick look at the chat before I move to the book club. Octopus Knight says, not all epidemiologists. Emmett Kelly's Earth says, the story from 1984, the speaker changing who the enemy was mid-speech comes to mind. Yes, it does. John Miller says, shake my head, these public healthcare professionals lost all credibility. Did you see the frontline workers out on the street clapping up a storm for the protesters who were not observing social distancing? Again, I've made a prediction that soon enough, the people responsible are saying social distancing. What was that? You had to stay 6 feet or 2 meters away. No, we never said that. Well, why would we say that? That never happened. That's a conspiracy theory. Okay, let's talk about conspiracy theories. Let's talk about conspiracy theories and the Central Intelligence Agency. Because you all know, you've been told again and again that conspiracy theories are very bad, or fomenting or promulgating conspiracy theories is wicked and perhaps should be criminal, right? If you read this book, which I highly recommend, by Tim Weiner, called Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA, you will find that pretty much every conspiracy theory with regard to foreign relations ascribed to the CIA or the American government is true. Plus, there's a whole bunch of things that were going on that you would never heard of. Now, one of the reasons that I like this book so much is because it is not one of those books where, oh, yes, my sources say, and your source is something you overheard at a bar or something that there's a rumor going around. Weiner makes it very clear, and the book has just an exhaustive number of footnotes. Everything in this book comes from records, memos, reports, oral histories, interviews. There are no anonymous. Yes, he says this book is on the record. No anonymous sources, no blind quotations, no hearsay. It is the first history of the CIA compiled entirely from first-hand reporting and primary documents. It is, by its nature, incomplete. No president, no director of Central Intelligence, and certainly no outsider can know everything about the agency. What I've written here is not the whole truth, but to the best of my ability, it is nothing but the truth. I hope it may serve as a warning. No republic in history has lasted longer than 300 years, and this nation may not long endure as a great power unless it finds the eyes to see things as they are in the world. That was once the mission of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, Legacy of Ashes, where does the title come from? Now, of course, the CIA was knocked into the minor leagues in 2004, and it is now subordinate to another agency, the Director of National Intelligence. And that's a cabinet level official. And this came about because of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. The CIA still exists, but it is not calling the shots in the way that it once did. Weiner writes, the CIA's centrality in the American government ended with the dissolution of the Office of Director of Central Intelligence in 2005. Now the CIA must be rebuilt if it is to survive. That task will take years. The challenge of understanding the world as it has overwhelmed 3 generations of CIA officers. Few among the new generation have mastered the intricacies of foreign lands, much less the political culture of Washington. In turn, almost every president, almost every Congress, and almost every director of Central Intelligence since the 1960s has proved incapable of grasping the mechanics of the CIA. Most have left the agency in worse shape than they found it. Their failures have handed future generations, in the words of President Eisenhower, a legacy of ashes. So, the United States didn't have intelligence. It didn't really have intelligence in a formalized way through the Second World War. What it has was the Office of Secret Services, which was led by the famous Wild Bill Donovan. And what it was engaged in primarily was covert operations. This book is very much a just the facts, ma'am. But it strikes me that when Weiner is describing the utter failure of CIA attempts to infiltrate agents into hostile countries, that there is a failure to understand the distinction between totalitarian countries and non-totalitarian countries. The CIA sent dozens of men into the Soviet Union. They were all captured and killed, every single one of them. The CIA had, I believe, one success with someone who came over with documents. Didn't come over. They were sent to the United States. He was useful for about a year, and then he was found out, and then he was killed. The OSS, of course, was working in France to a very large extent, and into countries, on the periphery of Germany, or Germany itself, in the let's say in the years 1944 to 1945. But of course, Germany was being bombed to the rubble at the time. Make the rubble shake, Winston Churchill said. Obviously, there was widespread dissatisfaction with the regime. Also, there was a loss of control by the regime. Now, in 1945, the communists had been in charge since 1917, and they were utterly ruthless. In a place like the Soviet Union, how could strangers be introduced there without being noticed immediately? That you talk about the party line, people were taught to quote things. The Bolshevik speak, they called it. And strangeness in appearance, strangeness in manner, strangeness of speech was going to be recognized immediately by a populace that was terrified that if they didn't turn people in, they would be accused of being traitors or spies themselves. So I don't think that the CIA understood, a similar situation, obtained with China and Albania and other countries, that I don't think the CIA had any understanding of the nature of a totalitarian regime. There's a hint there, total control. The biggest failure of the CIA, as demonstrated by Weiner, is human intelligence. Now, Edward Luttwak made this point very strongly in the most recent edition of his book, Coup d'etat. But the United States, the CIA, has never been good at human intelligence. It analyzes signals. It takes pictures from space of things on the ground. It reads newspapers and the like, but it has never had any success with human intelligence. And one of the reasons for that, as Weiner points out, is that it was common in CIA offices for the offices to be filled with people who did not speak the language of the country in which they were operating and had no knowledge whatsoever of the culture of those countries. Now, Weiner argues that the CIA was loath and was wrong to be loath about using American citizens who were, say, the children of immigrants from Muslim countries. And we're talking about after 1991, when terrorism became the biggest focus of the CIA. Well, I mean, obviously there's a serious problem there, as we've seen in the laboratories of America and elsewhere, where a great number of American Chinese, have been found out to be spies for the People's Republic of China. Weiner is not very favorable to James Jesus Angleton, who was the legendary or infamous, if you will, director of counterintelligence for the CIA. But one of the reasons why Angleton was in his position for so long was that he could boast that his operation had never been compromised. And one of the disasters for the CIA was that so many, in fact, overwhelming majority of the people that the CIA had brought to hostile countries, they were turned, and they sent false information back to the CIA. The CIA has very, very, very few successes in its history, and dozens or hundreds of failures or even disasters. The CIA failed to predict practically every significant development after 1945. It was the position of the CIA, and the CIA was not alone in this, that right up until 1989, that the Soviet Union was impregnable. In fact, the CIA took the position, and this was also held by a great many people in the United States, members of the elite. You see it in Paul Samuelson's well-known economics textbook, that economic conditions in the Soviet Union were great, and that the Soviet Union was going to surpass the United States in economic prosperity sometime in the early 21st century, maybe by 2020, say. And the CIA consistently overestimated the military strength, particularly the nuclear strength of the Soviet Union at one point by orders of magnitude. That's how bad their intelligence was. But of course, this has been a long tradition that one of the big issues in the 1960 presidential election between Kennedy and Nixon was the so-called missile gap, that a Republican, Eisenhower, had been president for 8 years, and Kennedy, who was a fierce Cold Warrior, was hammering at Nixon to great effect about this missile gap. Well, it turns out that the missile gap was entirely illusory. Later, in the late 1970s, in the CIA, this belief came to be powerfully held that the Soviet Union was looking for first strike capacity against the United States. This Plan B, it was called Plan B, that this was not true. The Soviet Union was not looking for a first strike capacity. And part of this was allegedly that the Soviet Union had made civil defense a top priority. This all petered out at the CIA. It's not mentioned in the book, but it's amusing to me. You can see this in Adam Curtis's documentary, The Power of Nightmares, that when Reagan became president in 1981, the neocons were in the ascendant. And Richard Pipes, the academic and expert on the Soviet Union, was given charge of a Plan B team, given the full resources of American intelligence to demonstrate his hypothesis that the Soviet Union was seeking a first strike capacity against the United States and the civil defense and all the rest of it. And so they went through everything. And they discovered there was no evidence whatsoever of this. But the conclusion that the Pipes team delivered to the president was the fact that there was no evidence of this proved that it must be true. Because, gosh, the Soviets are just so good at hiding things, much like Saddam Hussein was allegedly so great at hiding weapons of mass destruction. And the CIA was to a very large extent responsible for dragging America into an illegal and disastrous war. But the CIA did not consider the possibility that the Russians were going to bring medium-range nuclear weapons to Cuba. Now, John McCone, who's one of the few CIA directors who emerges with much glory from Legacy of Ashes, he kept saying that it makes sense. It makes sense that the Soviets would do this because we, that is to say the Americans, we have medium-range nuclear missiles in Turkey just across from the border with the Soviet Union. The CIA analyst said, no evidence. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And then guess what? It happened. Now, one of the reasons why the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba was because the CIA was engaged in an endless number of attempts, seemingly endless number of attempts, to assassinate Fidel Castro. And the man who was pushing the CIA to kill Castro was Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother and Attorney General of the United States. It's probably not a good idea to have brothers, holding such important roles in the same administration. Similarly, Weiner is he's not particularly happy with the concentration of power that resulted when Allen Dulles was director of the CIA, when his brother, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State. Now, there's a real bombshell in this book, which, I don't know, it seems to have been buried in the coverage that I've seen. And it has to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Of course, under Kennedy, the CIA made numerous attempts to kill Castro. And the legality of this and the morality of this, well, they weren't really seriously considered at the CIA, or the possible blowback, as they say. Now, of course, you have the Bay of Pigs incident, which is one of the most shameful incidents in American history, where Cubans, exiled Cubans, were roused to a frenzy with the promise that they would get their country back from Castro. Despite the fact that the United States has a naval base at Guantanamo, no, that wasn't going to be used for this sort of kind of invasion. They decided to land in a impenetrable mangrove swamp. Yeah, because they didn't have proper maps. They didn't have proper maps. Also, there weren't enough troops, and the decision was made that American troops were not going to be used, and then they broke their promise with regard to air cover. And they just got slaughtered on the beach. And the Cubans, the dying Cubans, with their last breath, shook their fist at the United States, and they were terribly embarrassed at having trusted President Kennedy. An even more shocking example than this has to do with Hungary, that the United States government, and here we go back to conspiracy theories, they denied this and denied it and denied it, and the truth only became known in this century. What they were denying was that the United States government had roused the Hungarians to rise up against the communists. That the Voice of Liberty was practically hysterical in its exhortations for the Hungarians to overthrow the communists, and the promise that America would come to their aid. Well, the Hungarians very bravely rose up, and for a period of a couple of weeks, they had a communist-free government. But of course, the CIA decided that Imre Nagy, he wasn't good enough leader for them, because he'd been, a former communist. And so that created some difficulties. But then the Red Army rolled in. Eisenhower wasn't going to do anything. One of the reasons was because there was a big problem on the other end of the world, and the CIA knew nothing about this, despite the fact that it should have been fairly obvious, which is after Nasser, president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, that the Anthony Eden, the prime minister of Great Britain, got together with the president of France and got together with the government of Israel and decided that they were together going to invade Egypt and take the canal back. And the CIA missed all this entirely. As I say, there are very few occasions on that they had successes. Well, they overthrew the government of Iran, which led to some blowback, you could say, in 1979. And they overthrew the government of Guatemala. These both happened in the 1950s. And the suspicion that these governments were going to be suborned by communists or will become openly communist, I don't know there was a lot of evidence in either case that this was going to happen. The result in Guatemala was the installation of one of the most brutal military dictatorships in the world. And a similar tack was taken in El Salvador. But no, one looks at the Hungarian Revolution and the irresponsibility of the American government in condemning many thousands of brave people to their deaths by making promises they had no reason to believe that their government would actually keep. But one of the big bombshells in this book has to do with the Warren Commission. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy. Well, there's been conspiracy theories about this from the beginning. And perhaps the reason for the conspiracy theories is that the CIA withheld information from the government of the United States and from the Warren Commission. Let's see. The file said that at 10:45 a.m. on October 1st, 1963, a man identifying himself as Lee Oswald had telephoned the Soviet embassy in Mexico City asking what was happening with his standing request for a visa to travel to the Soviet Union. With the invaluable help of the Mexican secret police, the Mexican City station had wiretapped the Soviet and Cuban embassies in an operation codenamed Envoy. The CIA had Oswald's call. Mexico had the biggest and most active telephone intercept operations in the whole world. J. Edgar Hoover used to glow every time that he thought of the Mexico station. Lee Harvey Oswald was a U.S. Marine, and he had served in Okinawa, where he had access to secret information. He defected to the Soviet Union, and he got a Russian wife. And then he said he wanted to come back to the United States. So he was allowed to go back to the United States. So what does he do back in the United States? Well, he makes an attempt to kill a right-wing American general. And he identifies himself with the Fair Play for Cuba committee. And he's ranting to everyone who will listen that the government is going to, pay for trying to bring down Castro. But it turns out that the CIA, yes, here we go. During Oswald's stay in the Soviet Union, CIA had no sources in a position to report on his activities or what the KGB might be doing with him, CIA agent Witten says. This was an internal report, but it was suspected that Oswald and all similar defectors were in the hands of the KGB. We were sure that all such defectors would be interrogated by the KGB, surrounded by KGB informants, wherever they were resettled in the Soviet Union, and even possibly recruited by the KGB for a mission abroad later on. Witten realized that the man who had shot the president could be a communist agent. He picked up the telephone and asked Helms to order an immediate review of all the Envoy tapes and transcripts in Mexico City. The CIA chief of station, Win Scott, quickly called the president of Mexico, whose secret police worked all night with the CIA's eavesdroppers to listen for traces of Oswald's voice. Word of the Oswald file spread as John McCone, the director, returned to CIA headquarters. 6 hours of hectic conferences ensued, the last one convening at 11:30 p.m. When McCone learned that the CIA had known beforehand of Oswald's trip to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, he was enraged, ripping into his aides, furious at the way the agency was run. The CIA's internal investigation took shape on Saturday morning, November 23rd. You will remember that Kennedy was shot November 22nd. Helms met with the agency's barons, including James Angleton. Angleton fully expected to be handled the Oswald case. To his outrage, Helms put John Witten in charge. Witten was a man who knew how to unravel a conspiracy. By mid-morning on November 23rd, CIA headquarters knew that Oswald had visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies repeatedly in late September and October, trying to travel as quickly as possible to Cuba and stay there until his Soviet visa came through. His having been to the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City obviously was a very important part of the initial impressions we had, Richard Helms, later director, said. Shortly after noon, McCone rushed back downtown and broke the news of the Cuban connection to President Johnson, interrupting a long talk between LBJ and Eisenhower. And Johnson called an old friend and confided, the thing on this assassin may have a lot more complications than you know about. It may lay deeper than you think. That afternoon, the U.S. ambassador in Mexico, Tom Mann, a Texan and close LBJ confidant, relayed his own suspicion that Castro was behind the assassination. But how it ended up was the CIA decided that they were going to withhold evidence from the Warren Commission. I read elsewhere, it's not confirmed in this book, that LBJ had informed Earl Warren that he did not want any discussion of the possibility that Kennedy had been killed on order of the Soviet Union or in revenge for the U.S. government's many attempts to overthrow Castro or to assassinate him. But, going back to conspiracy theories, what truth is supposed to be, sunlight is supposed to be the best disinfectant. It says the inscription on the CIA building is "The truth shall set you free," but as Weiner describes at great length, the CIA has never been very good at truth. It's never been very good at discovering it, understanding it, or disseminating it. With the result that, it's arguable that a great deal, perhaps most of the hatred that one encounters around the world against the United States is the result of activities by the CIA. But of course, every single American president since the CIA was founded in 1947 was pushing for covert missions, and covert missions are the deliberate interference in the affairs of foreign governments. I think this is an outstanding book. I've just touched on a few of the things in it. It is, again, one is really impressed by Weiner as a reporter and as someone who is able to marshal facts and create a compelling narrative from them. I think this is one of the best books explaining how the U.S. government works and the effects of U.S. government policy on world affairs, certainly that I've ever read. It has my, and Weiner, to the extent that he has any political beliefs, I can't discern them from this book, which I think is a good thing. And it's pretty rare among journalists now. So those are my thoughts on A Legacy of Ashes. I'll go to the back to the chat. Chogakin 666, Oswald had top secret level clearance. Oh, I want to mention one more thing. Oberyn Waugh wrote a novel based on this very idea that I'll spoil it somewhat. A peace activist, one of the world's biggest peace activists, is revealed to be a top Nazi who escaped in 1945. And he's a peace activist, but he is motivated by rage that the world proved that it wasn't worthy of Adolf Hitler. So the world must be destroyed. And so this peace activist is involved in the plot to have an American defector, a communist, kill the president of the United States in the full belief that it would lead to a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, thus ending life on Earth. And so Kennedy is assassinated by Oswald, and our peace activist, who poses as Dutch but is German, is beside himself with joy. And then he starts hearing the reports, right-wingers, right-wing hatred. The right wing is responsible for Kennedy's death. No, it was a communist. It was a communist. It was a KGB agent. But that is one of the prevailing myths of the Kennedy assassination. Apparently, it was the evil spirit of the city of Dallas that was responsible for Kennedy's death. Delacroix says, in Ireland, it's the 51st state of the U.S. It's a blue one in overdrive. We need the Marines over here to take out the NGOs. Yes, Ireland has decided that it wants to become a colony of Nigeria for reasons that are beyond me. Don from Beyond says, Judy Vary, Oswald's mistress, is still tirelessly trying to clear his name. Walrus Libertarian says, just tell them Dems are the real racists. The Republicans have been, they're still doing this. In Tom Cotton's piece, he mentioned Orville Faubus, who was the governor of Arkansas in 1957, who called out the National Guard to prevent integration. And Tom Cotton made much of the fact that he was a Democrat and a racist. Yeah, let's relitigate 1957. Oh, the Republicans were the good guys back in 1957, also in the 1960s. I must confess to my shame that up until, I don't know, the mid-90s, maybe as late as 1997 or something. I used to play along with this DR3 game. I'm terribly sorry, but you know, I got sworn off that more than 20 years ago. It's pointless. It's absolutely pointless. Lecomte de Brea says Karens are more dangerous than Antifa. I think you have something there. Walrus Libertarian says it's funny if you say the N-word, then they have the free reign to drop everything and attack you. Well, even if it is rumored that you said it, or even if it's just made up. Ahmad Hussein says that he was followed in stores. We have no idea whether this is true. We're supposed to be rational people. Well, you know, any statement made by a person is simply a claim in the absence of corroborating evidence. But when people tell their sad stories about racism, well, this must be true. Forget that the person has a vested and often a pecuniary interest in flogging this story. No, we would never doubt. You know that, you know, it's like women don't lie. Well, people who've suffered racism or claim to have suffered racism, they never lie either. If you want to read more about Lee Harvey Oswald, in particular, I highly recommend Edward J. Epstein's book called Legend. Everything Edward J. Epstein does is good. I reviewed his book, The Hollywood Economist, on the old Luke Ford book club. No, but that's an excellent book. So, yeah, LBJ. It's just, yeah, that you get, you know, Tom Bethel, excellent writer, many years at the American Spectator. He's from Britain. He came to the United States in the 1960s because he was attracted by New Orleans jazz. And so he finds himself in New Orleans, and I guess he's looking for a job, and he ends up working for Jim Garrison. He's one of Jim Garrison's investigators. There's a collection of his essays that was published some years ago in which he goes into this in great detail. And what was the names? What was it? Clay Shaw, the homosexual with alopecia or whatever. Bethel admits that he tipped off Clay Shaw because Bethel explains that there's a theory called the two Oswalds theory, that you had two men posing as the same men acting in Dallas on that day, which explains some of the supposed discrepancies in the official narrative. So one day Bethel comes into the office and the other investigator says, you know the two Oswalds theory? And Bethel says, yeah. And the other fellow says, I don't think that's true. No, I think there were three Oswalds. And Bethel wrote that it was that point that I came to the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed John F. Kennedy. You know, I will say in closing, I noticed this as a child, really, that it seemed to me this hysteria about Kennedy, first the hysteria about Kennedy's death. He wasn't all that popular a president. And then the hysteria about the various conspiracies. Yeah, you're going to bring in some, New Orleans homosexuals to do this? Yeah, of course you would. You know, of course you would. That it seemed to me that America psychically was coming apart at the time. And I don't think America ever recovered from the assassination of Kennedy. Metal Mike, I believe that Oswald was the lone gunman. And there is a book, I'm trying to remember the book on Lee Harvey Oswald that makes this very clear, this thesis. I recommend it to you. I'm just going to look up the name here. Product of years of work. You see, the theories that it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald depend on a whole bunch of actually ridiculous things going on. The book is called Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK by Gerald Posner, and it was published in 1993. Anyway, that's it for the week. There was no Theater Thursday this week. I'm still struggling with this sound problem. I have got a USB sound card, but I still can't make the speakers work. Perhaps I have, got the settings wrong. I only spent about 5 or 10 minutes attempting to get it works, and I just had that thought: plug and play my ass. This seems to be far more complicated than it needs to be. It's a Creative Labs sound blaster, but I hope to have that worked out this weekend. Final word from our Finnish friend Jaakko Raipala. It's surreal how fast the NGO pause spreads to small countries. We had a BLM protest at the Lutheran Cathedral here, arranged by the clergy, which is no longer just female. They're now gender queer. That's very sad. I've never been to Finland, but I think of it very fondly because of Marshall Mannerheim, and above all because of Jean Sibelius, who is my favorite composer. Thank you all for tuning in. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you would hit the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. I will be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you would like to support the show with a donation, which I could really very much use at this time, given the conditions in which I live, my PayPal account is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. I will leave you with my traditional benediction and farewell, which has been somewhat modified in the last week because of the apotheosis of St. George Floyd. In these days of social atomization and the sack of Rome, I do dearly hope that all of you find some genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Thanks and good night.